Hello, real estate investing fools. I'm here today with Nick Latz, Chief Revenue Officer of Zego, which is powered by PayLease. Zego has a bunch of different services for multifamily management, including Zego Mobile Doorman. So we're going to talk today about resident experience, which is an important thing in buildings right now and something that I'm very interested in. I feel like, Nick, we're at this point right now, everyone's realized that traditional property management, it's not so great. It could use a little improvement. I know that at Zego, you guys are focused on resident experience management. So what are the biggest pain points that you're seeing?
Yeah, that's right, Deidre. It's a great time to be focused on the residential real estate space, and in particular the rental segments which we serve. And one of the things we see is that if you look over the last 18 months, the world certainly changed, and that's definitely true for residential real estate as well. And so, we're seeing a couple of macro trends within the rental markets in particular. The first is that rental growth is fluctuating. And so we went through, last year, 2020, where we saw decreases in rent growth rent over year. Now in the summer, it's very strong, and no one's really sure where the growth is going to shake out for the fall and winter. So you're seeing more fluctuations than you have in the past. The second trend that we're seeing in the rental space is that resident demographics are really shifting. And so now, for the first time, you have 2/3 of your residents on average are either Gen Z or millennials. So shifting demographics. And the third trend that we see is that key resident touch points are increasingly going digital. And so if you kind of look at those trends, one of our perspectives at Zego, and we talk to our customers, we're seeing that communication across properties between residents and property staff and resident satisfaction are more important today than they ever have been. And so to address, your question is, hey, what are the pain points? When we talk to our customers, they're citing a couple of things that are pain points that they're really focused on. The first is resident retention. And so in today's environment where rent growth is less predictable, less consistent, holding on to your residents and keeping them happy is more and more important for folks. Second thing they talk about is contactless interactions. And so how do residents and staff interact with each other, communicate with each other in increasingly contactless ways where residents or staff prefer those options. And the third is brand and property reputation. And so one of the things that the industry is seeing and has been for several years is the proliferation of review sites is a way that, future residents get information on a property. And as those reviews become more and more common, they affect properties in more ways, right? So one is, if your resident has a bad experience at your property in the past, that may have only impacted that resident and their choice to renew or the people that those residents interacted with. Well, now if they post a review, it can impact your ability to attract future residents as well. And so those reviews have become more and more important.
Yeah, that is so true, because when I moved to a new city and looked for an apartment, that was one of the first things that I looked at was on different sites. And a lot of times it really does come down to someone who has a bad experience, and they share it and they make it sound like the place is terrible, and certainly may not even be true. And so one of the things that's a problem with that too is it's very hard to get a bad review taken down. I've certainly seen that happen too, is that someone does that and then you're kind of stuck with it, right?
That's right. And there's best practices around reviews in terms of, how to respond to them, how to be proactive in terms of staying on top of them. But one of the best things that we've seen and we talk to our customers about is how do you solicit positive reviews as well, right? Because you usually, when it's Yelp or anything else, when are you most likely to make a review? You're most likely to make a review when you might be upset about a service level or something that's happening. And so there are definitely things that companies are doing, that management companies are doing to be able to systematically track, hey, when do residents have a good experience? Maybe we interact with them around maintenance, right? And so how can we know when they have a good maintenance experience? How can we survey them as an example? And if they give a 4 or 5 star in their maintenance experience, how can we design systems and tools and processes where at that time of satisfaction, we trigger a review request? And that's one way that properties can proactively solicit those positive reviews. That's
really smart. Let's talk about something else that was really a problem during the pandemic is everybody started ordering more and more things. One of the things I keep hearing about buildings is the receiving of packages, Amazon hubs, problems with the hubs going down, problems with package theft, things being left out. It's this massive problem across buildings. How do you get rid of the boxes fast enough? What are you seeing in that space?
I think that's true. I don't see it shifting back to pre-pandemic levels. I think if you look at the volume of e-commerce transactions, just over a 3-year period, if you look at the volume of e-commerce transactions globally in 2019, I think it was about 3.5 trillion globally. And the forecast for 2022 are 7 trillion. So a doubling, even from where we were a year or two ago, which is just amazing to think about. And COVID has certainly accelerated that. There's more home deliveries now than there have been in the past. We have a customer, a large property manager in the space, Zego Management, that actually surveyed their residents last year in 2020 and said, because they were trying to think about solving this problem over the long term. And what they asked their residents are, hey, we know that you're ordering more goods to your communities, to your apartments now than in the past. Do you plan to shift back after the pandemic lessens and we return to normal? And the answer is no. 90% of residents responded that, hey, we plan same level or more of delivering, e-commerce goods to their apartments going forward. So I think it's a big challenge. It's a big problem to stay on top of it. At Zego, we actually wrote a guide, did a bunch of research, talked to a bunch of customers, wrote a guide on this earlier this year. And there's really 5 models that are out there in multifamily around handling packages. And they each come with their pros and cons. But the 5 models are, one would be kind of the old school traditional method where on-site teams bear the full burden of, kind of collecting and distributing those packages. The second one is we are seeing more package management apps as part of portals or mobile resident experience platforms to help residents and staff communicate with those. Third is we're seeing package lockers, and sometimes those come with apps as well. The fourth would be some properties actually building out smart package rooms, right, where there's dedicated space, sometimes managed by third parties within the property to track these packages, house these packages, and communicate with residents. And then we're actually starting to see some third-party package delivery services, almost like a PO box type model where the packages get delivered somewhere else off-site, and you have a third party, work with your residents to deliver those packages.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to consider there. All right, let's talk a little bit about maintenance because you mentioned that earlier. I feel like it's something that nobody likes to deal with. It's a hassle for landlords. It's a hassle for tenants. I think if you make it a hassle for tenants, then you have the worry that they're not going to report stuff, and that can cost everyone a lot of money. How do you make that experience easier on both sides?
Yeah, I think maintenance is a problem, is a challenge, and it has been for a while. When we did a resident experience management, the first kind of state of the industry resident experience management report earlier this year. We actually surveyed 600 property management companies around retention or drivers of retention. And we matched that up against some industry data that's actually surveyed residents and asked them about reasons that they move out. And when you look at the reasons that residents move out of their community, about 30% of the time when residents move out, they cite some kind of maintenance reason associated with that. Maintenance may not be the primary reason 30% of the time, but it's attached to the reason 30% of the time. So it is a big driver around why people move. In parallel, rent.com did a big study a couple of years ago where they actually looked at those resident reviews online that we were talking about earlier. And they found that one, maintenance was one of the top things that were discussed or written about in those reviews. And two, that 80% of the time that maintenance was mentioned in a review, it was negative. versus positive. And so it is a big challenge both for residents and staff. And, we found that there's some different, best practices around that you can take from a property perspective. The first would be you've got to make it easy for residents to submit a maintenance request, and they've got to know how to do that. The second is I think leading managers on this are proactive. They don't just wait for the maintenance request to come in. They have actually proactive maintenance processes where they're reaching out at certain times in the resident life cycle, proactively do maintenance. And then the third would be just the simple thing of following up and doing surveys and check-ins after maintenance requests to make sure the full extent of the issue got addressed. Could be a best practice as well.
Do you think maintenance is also connected to cleanliness? I know that's one of the things that reviews really hit on. And I think some of that is, cleanliness of things like the lobby, stairways, things like that. Seems like it was a big issue, obviously, during the pandemic. Is that something else that you're tracking as well?
I think so. When you look at our survey data around why residents leave, physical appearance and cleanliness of common areas is a big one. And, it's funny because sometimes managers don't always know. Sometimes residents outside of their unit, won't say anything if they don't like the lobby or they have a question with the common areas in terms of maintenance. And so I think it's always good practice to be, reaching out to your residents via surveys in particular. So you can have a systematic and a kind of continuous process around, hey, from a cleanliness perspective, from a maintenance perspective, what's working for you and where do we have opportunities to improve?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about older buildings. I think that's one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that older buildings that maybe always did one thing one way, now all of a sudden had to figure out how to do mobile payments. But I think part of that is also we're seeing older buildings kind of get into I hate saying the digital age, but that sort of is what it is with adding, using apps, using products like Zego, putting in smart home features. What are you seeing in terms of older buildings trying to refresh and attract the modern tenant?
Yeah, I think it's a good observation. I don't think that the age of the building or the physical amenities of the building today have to restrict the resident experience. And I think that there are increasingly resident experience management technology platforms like Zego that really help operators modernize their overall resident experience. And they provide things like digital amenities, self-service options for residents and for staff, more seamless and modern ways that staff and properties and residents can interact with each other. An increase of services maybe via a marketplace, right? So you don't have to have just on-property services or amenities, right? Maybe digital services like offering local deals at the pizza place around the corner can be increased resident conveniences that have nothing to do with the actual physical amenities on the property.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of buildings haven't really investigated is how many ancillary services that they could offer. Things like pet sitting, fluff and fold and dry cleaning and all. There's so many things, so many other ways to make revenue. I think that some buildings haven't quite figured out. But you mentioned something interesting I want to circle back on, which is this idea of kind of community inside of multifamily buildings. Because I've been wondering about this myself. Is community something that helps with retention? Does it make sense if you're a multifamily owner to have meetups within and make the residents kind of get to know each other? Is that sense of community important?
I think it's extremely important. In our survey data, when we did the state of resident experience management, the large scale survey we did, we actually asked residents, hey, when you renew your lease, what are the top drivers? What's important? What's not important in that renewal decision? And what was super interesting about that data is reasons 2, 3, and 4 will vary depending on who you ask, right? But the first reason is amazingly consistent for why people renew, and it's the sense of community, the feeling of community that they either have or don't have within apartments. So I think it's a top driver. And one of the organizations that's actually been a guest on our podcast and we learned a lot from, they've done a lot of research on this, is called Apartment Life. And Apartment Life has published what they call the friendship factor. And they've actually done a large scale surveys and they've looked at residents. And what they found is this correlation between the number of friends people have within their community to their likelihood of renewal. And what that data actually shows is that for every 2 friends that you have within your apartment community, you're 10% more likely to renew your lease, right? And so if you have 0 friends in your community, I think you're 30% chance of renewing your lease at the end of a year. But if you have 2 friends in your community, that goes up to 40%. If you have 4 friends, it goes up to 50%. So you really do see this positive correlation between people you interact with in your week to week life and your experience at your community and your satisfaction with your community.
That's fascinating. And that really relates to the next question, that I wanted to ask is about shared amenities, because in the past year, buildings, they had to shut down the pool, they had to shut down the gym, they had to really scale all of that kind of shared amenities back, which before that they were really promoting. So now it's sort of, we're in this weird space with the Delta variant where some buildings are closing their amenities, some aren't, some are requiring masks. There's all sorts of confusion right now. But what should landlords and owners be thinking about right now when it comes to shared amenities?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've heard some people phrase it from the standpoint of, hey, our pools is important and prevalent as they used to be, or gyms is important and prevalent as they used to be because of these restrictions. I think the answer to that is it depends sometimes on the market. I think it can depend on the property and the community's kind of positioning within the market and the types of the residents that they're trying to attract. But I don't foresee kind of a wide scale kind of change in the importance or the value of pools and gyms. I just think there's more of a burden on management staff than there used to be in terms of how do you do reservations, for these pools and gyms and physical amenities? How do you make it safe and convenient for both residents and staff to interact with these physical amenities? How do you think about things like access in a contactless world? How do you think about things like space planning? And for managers to get this right for things like the gym, I think it actually helps post-COVID too, and helps them get value and satisfaction out of the gym. Like a lot of times these on-site gyms are small. They only have 2 treadmills, right? And if you like to work out before work like I do, like I would love it if I could go in there in my app and see if the treadmills are reserved or not, or be able to reserve them. And so I do think for managers to get this figured out in terms of how to manage these spaces differently, I think it's a differentiator going forward.
What are you seeing about business centers? A lot of talk lately about remote work, people not going back to the offices. Are you seeing a lot of buildings add business centers and thinking about remote work in that way?
I do see some buildings, especially new developments, that are, their position in the market is working professionals. Think about shared working spaces, almost like WeWork type amenities, mini WeWork type of amenities. I think that's certainly attractive to certain segments, because if you look at trends in residential real estate and on the single family side as well, you're actually, with new single family homes that are being built, you're actually seeing more of an emphasis on like the office space, right? Like, where do we work? My neighbors that live next door actually just moved because they have 2 children and their house was great when only one of them worked from home, but now they both work from home. And so they actually moved to a different house when, pre-COVID, it wasn't an issue. So I do think, what you do within your apartment is changing, and those types of amenities that reflect the changing needs of people and where they work are important. And I think they will be post-COVID too, because I think you're seeing, companies are going to one of 3 models as it relates to where you work. One is remote first, and you're seeing a bunch of companies kind of do remote first. They were going to be remote forever. The second is hybrid, where you're no longer going to the office 5 days a week, but you're going in a couple days a week to an actual office. And then, some companies will continue to be 5 days in the office. But I don't think this is just a COVID or a pandemic thing. I think where you work is really fundamentally changing going forward.
I would completely agree with that. You just mentioned the single family rentals. We've watched that boom. We've also seen, it seems like, preference within multifamily to smaller buildings, garden style apartments, things like that. Is that something you're seeing as well? Is that it may be harder to rent right now in some of the bigger towers?
In terms of kind of new developments or in terms of just kind of new multifamily units being added?
Both, really. I mean, we know that there was sort of a flight away from cities, and so some of those larger buildings were suffering. Now it seems like there's not quite a flight back to cities, but it does seem like rents are increasing in those areas. So I'm wondering if people are coming back to those bigger buildings now.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the data that I've seen is, as of this summer, the big office towers, the Class A properties are seeing more demand. But it's been interesting if you've kind of lived in a big urban center over, call it, the last 3 years, kind of 2018, 2017 to 2020. The number of kind of cranes, downtown building big towers, and they're largely residential towers, was huge. You've never seen anything like it except for maybe 2007. And everything that was being built was largely kind of Class A, premium product, high amenity product. And so I think what you've seen is that there's plenty of development. There's plenty of new supply that's come online with the big office towers online. I think 2020 probably paused the rate of new development, right? And for the Class A product downtown, while developers kind of waited for things to shake out. And so I think that's probably what's driving the more kind of garden style product in the suburbs, is just the idea that, hey, we're pretty good on supply of big towers in downtown urban markets. And what are some additional ways you can add units to maybe some of these secondary and suburban markets?
Yeah, I feel like the demand for workforce housing is huge right now. I just saw some news earlier that that another joint venture, like $2 billion toward multifamily workforce housing in California. Like, everyone's trying to solve this problem now because they've suddenly realized that it's a problem, that the market kind of has gotten a little lopsided, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. There needs to be more emphasis, or shift on the supply side to a diversity of product.
What other trends are you seeing right now when it comes to multifamily?
The biggest trend that we're seeing in multifamily, and this kind of goes to our focus on the resident experience, is we're seeing operators shift from this idea that, hey, we have to put all of our emphasis on new resident acquisition. And we're seeing more shift to focus on resident retention. And I think one of the drivers for that, when we did our State of the Resident Experience Management survey, one of the things that survey pointed to and pointed out, and I don't think it's always been kind of commonly known within the space, is that the actual cost of resident turnover or resident leaving their apartment is $3,500. By the time you add up, on average, lost rent, concessions, the actual maintenance and repair that goes into that unit, it costs $3,500 for communities and apartments to turn a unit. And when you think about that, it's a really high cost. When you think about the fact that, hey, even if I'm able to bring in a new resident pretty quickly, and even if, say, I'm able to charge that resident more, say $200 more than the previous resident, it still takes 18 months to break even from that new resident versus having the previous resident stay and renew their lease for another year, right? And that's true because you take the $3,500 and divide by $200, and it's 18 months to break even. And I don't think owners and operators have always fully realized that and done the math. And so I think now you are starting to see more operators really focus in on resident experience, resident satisfaction, with the ultimate goal of retaining the residents longer. Just because it's good business.
That makes sense. Well, that kind of brings me to my last question. On your site, I've seen the phrase surprise and delight. So I've seen that in hospitality a lot. I don't really see that as much on the residential side, so I love seeing that. What does that phrase surprise and delight mean to you and to the company?
I think for us, it means going above and beyond. I think that parallel that you made around the hospitality industry is a good one. Because I think the hospitality one is one that multifamily operators have studied and probably will continue to study. And in hospitality, within the overall commercial real estate paradigm, probably leads the pack in terms of branding and the guest experience and the positioning of their properties. And why are they the best at it? Well, they're probably the best at it because the industry's had to develop an operating model around short-term leases, and in many cases, one-night leases that you have with a hotel. They don't have the luxury of having their guests locked in for a year or 2 years, or in the case of commercial, multi-year leases. And so I think they've had to get really, really good at delivering differentiated and delightful guest experiences. And I think that's going to increasingly translate to the multifamily side. I think that's part of the reason that we're really focused on the resident experience, and so are our customers. Because I think people are increasingly seeing the business value as they're more and more, the supply continues to grow and operators are forced to kind of differentiate your property. I think focusing on resident experience, resident satisfaction, ultimately resident retention is something that everybody's focused on.
I would absolutely agree with that. Well, Nick, thank you very much for your time today. Listeners, you can learn more about Zego at gozego.com. Stay well and stay invested.